Okay, here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
No, only on the phone. Try here. I'm gonna pass the mic. And try.
Okay, good. Can you hear me? Okay. Wait. Yes. Okay. So now that we both can hear each other, I'm going to pass the mic because we've been having some technical difficulties in the last two debates. So me and Bronson are arguing whether globalism is more economically advantageous than nationalism, where Bronson is going to once again open it up.
All right. So for the third time, my case is basically free trade is good for everyone in the entire world. There's always going to be outliers, so there is going to be some losers, but in general, both rich and poor countries benefit from free trade. We benefit in the form of lower prices. They benefit in the form of higher wages. And I would make a distinction between the average worker. I would remove the distinction between workers in certain countries. I don't think that's a valid distinction. I think all workers should be treated equally. And so I should have no reason in particular to favor someone in, let's say, Montana over someone in Bangladesh. As long as the average worker is actually improving, to me, that's a good thing. And the case for free trade pretty much the evidence speaks for itself. All the wealthy countries of the world do practice free trade. That's true whether we're talking about Hong Kong or Singapore or the United States of America, New Zealand, the European Union. All the wealthy countries of the world practice free trade. That's why even communist countries like Vietnam and China decided to open up their markets to market liberalization, and they've become exponentially richer in the process. So the case for free trade really speaks for itself. That's why America was founded as a free trade zone. That's why we don't have economic barriers between the states. One could make the argument that Alaska would be better off producing their own pineapples rather than importing from Hawaii. You could say that their government could subsidize the local pineapple industry there, and they could grow them hydroponically, and that would increase wages there in Alaska. And I suppose we could do the same, and we could try to raise salmon here in Hawaii. But ultimately, that's just going to make everyone worse off. It's a very inefficient use of resources, and instead, free trade is a much better solution. So I'm going to pass the mic back to you.
I'm just going to summarize my opening again. Bronson was able to preview it, but I'm taking an ethnocentric view based on the fact that I look at the United States, its history, and I want to actually concede two specific points. I don't argue that globalism for poor nations, when you open up trade barriers for, just say, whether it be during the fall of the Soviet Union, or whether it be Vietnam, or whether it be Hong Kong. When poor nations open up their trade barriers, they're actually able to ascertain or be able to attain more wealth than they otherwise would have because they don't actually have the means to produce the resources themselves. My argument isn't disputing a specialization. My argument is specifically on globalism within the modern context of America. Since 1977, the wages for the average American household have been stagnant. That's over 30 years with stagnant wages. So we basically have to look at the sources for why wages are stagnant. Basically, we can pinpoint it down to two things. With the movement of globalism, the United States basically signed a few trade agreements, NAFTA, CAFTA, and most recently that was in dispute in the last election was the TPP. What these did was put specialized workers who normally had degrees in computer science, engineering, or other specialized degrees suddenly found that their careers were no longer safe, and their expertise was no longer valid or no longer valued in the same manner. So what happened was these wages have been undercut by people on the outside. The second problem of globalism is dumping. Dumping is when was when you open up your trade borders to countries that have international corporations that have economies of scope that already supersede the entire basis of the existing economy domestically. The best example I can give you is how China uses slave labor to be able to dump goods into Walmart, and they're able to mass market advertising. And lastly, and I'll get into it, is protecting wages.
Yeah, so Walmart's good, and free trade with China is good. Nobody benefits more from Walmart than the poor. I know it's a common myth in certain circles that the poor are actually worse off because of Walmart, because Walmart pays low wages. But Walmart employs less than 1% of the population, and far more than 1% of the population actually shops at Walmart. And it's not rich people who are shopping at Walmart, let's face it. The reason to shop at Walmart would be the lower prices. That's the reason we import from China. Otherwise, there would be no reason at all to import from China. They have crappy products generally compared to America, but they are much cheaper. To give you another example, if your iPhone were, I have a Samsung, so if your phone were manufactured here in America, it would cost over $3,000. You know, it could be up to like 15 grand, depending on which state it was manufactured in and what kind of regulations they're dealing with. Now, yes, it would improve wages for the people who are making those phones. But remember, they're always going to be a smaller portion of the entire economy. So what you're suggesting is that everyone else should suffer. The supermajority, which is consumers, we're all consumers, we are the actual supermajority in society, we would all suffer in order to inflate your wages that probably shouldn't even exist because you're not competitive in a free market, free economy. So what you're suggesting is that all consumers should have to pay the price for your largesse, which doesn't make sense. It makes more sense that we pay $500 or $600 or $700 for our phones rather than $5,000 for our phones. Nobody's going to be better off like that. The poor certainly are not going to be better off paying. They're going to be cut out of the cell phone market completely. So they just don't get cell phones because of this kind of economic policy that you're suggesting. So it really doesn't matter, if a few people get higher wages, because in the end, everyone, the largest group, consumers, particularly the poor, will suffer more than anyone else.
Okay, I think that Bronson brought up a few good. I just want to take these one at a time. I actually want to make sure that we can distinguish between an individual actor engaging in free commerce between any individual that he wants. And the analogy to the United States to be able to actually say we're not going to put up borders between startup businesses from engaging in commerce across that border. That's a point I understand. What we're dealing with in today's economy is we're dealing with basically corporations that have massive economies of scope, that have special rights that undermine the existing domestic market. With Walmart, I'm not arguing that we should be paying Walmart workers more. I'm saying that Walmart is the result of outside companies in China using slave market labor, which you can't compete with domestically or actually anywhere else, to saturate the market with low quality goods, and in a slow precipice in the last 30 years, being able to undermine every single domestic market. Now, the result of that has been existing skill sets that created new structural employment, because people that have technical skills that would be more valuable being applied in today's resources are that most people want to actually get. For the best example I can give you is most people want a tech support person that actually speaks fluent English, not because they have any bias against the person that speaks fluent English, but because they need somebody that can be as clear as possible and somebody that is educated or to a place that's near them, an Ivy League school, that would be more applicable to getting them exactly what the service that they want. In today's economy, corporations are the ones that are going to be supplying these jobs. So corporations are doing two things to prevent these people from attaining wages. They're outsourcing all the jobs to wherever you see it. Like you see that they said that we were going to have a service sector economy in the early 2000s. We see that that's already gone, as now service sector jobs are all being outsourced to India, Scandinavia, Japan, China, wherever they can find it, where there's cheap goods. Third is the very notion of the free trade agreements. Free trade agreements only give special exemptions to corporations that drive down costs for some goods while driving up costs of goods at home. Now, through the use of it, we have a national trade deficit for the last 22 straight years. 1991 was the last year we had a trade surplus. That's the result of globalization. What that means is when you have a trade deficit is that the net amount of wealth is actually leaving the nation. Every single year you have a net investment from the nation, being the United States, has been leaving and going outside of the nation. That means the only people coming in are foreign investors and people buying up assets, pricing out individuals that would normally be able to find it.
Okay. Well, I think your first point about outsourcing, I've already addressed completely. Outsourcing is good. The reason being is that otherwise your phone would cost $5,000, your cars would cost a hell of a lot more, your clothes would cost even more than that. Everything inside of your home would cost more, and the people who are least able to afford higher price increases are in fact the poor and the working class. So if I'm rich, I don't really care if prices go up that much, because normally I'm not buying cheap goods anyways. I'm buying higher quality, higher price goods that come from Western countries, and I'm not buying cheap crap from China. So actually that cheap crap that you're talking about benefits the poor more than it benefits everyone else. And it's not just the cheap crap from China either. Like even having your phone manufactured in Korea, for example, rather than America, makes it much cheaper for a variety of reasons. And so even though the slave labor that you're talking about in China are these sweatshops, remember, in the last 20 years, we've lifted 1 billion people out of abject poverty. That is 1 billion people were living in abject poverty in the last 20 years, and they are no longer living there. And they are objectively better off now, even with the slave labor or the sweatshops or whatever. Their life was obviously worse before so the sweatshop is in fact an improvement over life before the sweatshop or before the slave labor, when they were living in abject poverty. So I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but traditional farming is not a better option than a sweatshop, for example, where you have a steady wage, and most importantly, you have some kind of way to improve your lot in life, which was not the case for your average farmer living in China or India or everywhere prior to the Industrial Revolution and free trade and globalized economies. So all workers are much better off today than they were in 1975, independent of whatever the wages were then, because you can still buy cheaper things now than you ever were able to do then. The other point that you brought up was that specialization, and they're favoring specialization for people overseas. To me, I would say, well, they're part of the average too, right? If we're talking about the average worker, if someone in India who has the same degree and everything, if they're actually better off and their wage is increasing by double or triple than it otherwise would be, that's still a net gain for the average worker, in my view. I mean, we are still better off. And the other thing you said is that people they don't want to talk to someone in India. That's not technically true, because what people say is different from how their dollars vote. So people might say they want to talk to someone who speaks good English, but are they willing to pay the higher prices that would require? And the evidence demonstrates otherwise.
Okay, I think I've answered the specific point about the people that have a choice between abject poverty and slave labor. The point is when you have a market that hasn't been exposed to that, and then that have been trading free with rule of law, where individuals have the ability to have social mobility and be able to move from one skill to another, be able to move from one position to another, and be able to start a business. Right? When you open up that market to a market that has slave labor as the competition, the market that was thriving will suddenly stagnates. And that stagnating market is what is the reason that the average worker has not had a wage increase in 30 years. And yes, you point out to a very specific good point, and this needs to actually be reaffirmed. If you were to buy these things domestically at the moment, they would be double, triple, quadruple the price. Why is that? 30 years ago, those exact same goods were not $3,500. Let me give you a good example. A good example would be groceries. Why, if with the logic of being able to outsource all of our groceries should be going down in price. However, this is a necessary good that every single consumer needs to produce. However, you see that domestic goods for all groceries, whether it be agriculture, meat, produce, cheese, they all have gone up in the last 30 years steadily. And if they were, and the ones that weren't outsourced have gone up much more. That's a result of our government running trade deficits and being able to actually not be able to pay for the account deficit that they've been running for over 22 years. I'll pass the mic on that.
So Hong Kong produces quite literally nothing at all. There are basically no natural resources in Hong Kong. Hong Kong does not grow any food, and yet they have world-class cuisine there, and everyone's rich. And why is that? Because Hong Kong has been known as a bastion of free trade for the last 100 years. You don't have to actually produce your own things in order to enjoy them. You can simply import them from other places, as Hong Kong does. And is anybody in Hong Kong saying, hey, we need to start putting tariffs on these goods and we need to start erecting these barriers to trade? No, because that's ridiculous. Protectionism is what their own countries, your own government does to you, what other countries would do to you in wartime, which is a blockade, right? They would stop the goods from coming in, and everyone in your society would be forced to produce your own goods, and nobody's better off like that. That's why blockades work in the first place. So blockading is not good, and protectionism is just a domestic form of blockading your own ports, basically. And that's why Hong Kong and Singapore and the United States and no other major country in the world actually does that. We want goods to come in. We want these cheaper goods because they're good for us. And at the same time, we can export the things that we're better at producing. That's why Hawaii, we don't try to grow our own salmon here. Instead, we export pineapples and sugarcane and other things that we're better at producing, and we import other things that we're not so good at producing, like corn or oil or, for example, salmon from Alaska. It doesn't make sense that they would try to produce these things on their own and put up trade barriers to help their local industries and their local wages over there. Wages are determined by market forces. They're not determined. Governments can't decide who should get paid what and for what reason. I mean, these are determined by economics. And practically every argument that you've given so far could equally apply to automation. You could say, well, under automation, these jobs will no longer exist. Well, guess what? Who cares? Because the production is going up, and that's the main thing that's important. Because if we're still having the same number of cars or more cars even for a lower price, it really doesn't matter about your wages. Because if you can buy a car for example, $5,000, a brand new car, you're still better off even if you're making, $10,000 less than you otherwise would have been. And that's the point I wanted to make with you about you said the wages have stagnated or the economy has stagnated. No, you're still able to buy a lot more things than you otherwise would have been able to buy if it weren't for globalization. You wouldn't be able to afford a cell phone to begin with. You just simply wouldn't have one, and or a laptop, for example, or an iMac. And you're trying to argue that somehow you're worse off because your wages have stagnated? No, your current wages buy more than they ever would have back then.
Average consumer debt since 1977 has increased tenfold since the opening up of the NAFTA and CAFTA agreements for the United States worker. Remember, I'm not advocating for any quotas, blockades, or any government policies to be able to solve any of these issues. I'm arguing that the only people that should be operating in a market that has a rule of law are markets that have rule of law. If the argument basically against abolishing slavery in the South, I believe, in the early 1800s, was an argument against automation. I'm not arguing against automation. Automation is a natural process whereby the wealth of the nation domestically is able to supersede the productive capacity that existed prior. It's important to note that the existing productive capacity of today's economy not increased. The productive capacity of the United States economy has remained stagnant with wages, with globalization, because we've, instead of moving what domestic innovation to structurally move new jobs to new areas and to move technology forward, every single opportunity is being outsourced. And I mean that quite literally. Like whether it be technology companies that are centered in the United States, or whether it be any tech companies that are giving you your support on the phone. The source of this is the same. They're not operating on a level playing field where they have rule of law on their side. If they can actually force their people, whether they say, okay, our labor market is you get to die or you get to be in slave labor, and you have to compete with that domestically, it's not a level playing field. And we can see the results of that by the net flow of funds in our domestic market have been shying away, and it's the result is every average consumer has tenfold more debt than they did 30 years ago. The average person cannot pay for their college education anymore. The average person sees that the average asset prices of everything that they want domestically is increases, and yet the only thing that remains the same in prices are things that are produced by slave goods. What that is the slow degradation of the economic capacity of the United States, and thus the average worker suffers.
Okay, you keep bringing up the idea of slave labor. I've already demonstrated to you that 1 billion people have been lifted out of abject poverty, and that they are objectively better off now than they were before they were slaves, apparently. But they're not really slaves. They could leave their factory jobs at any time and go back to farming, but nobody's doing that, obviously, because that sucks even worse than a sweatshop or slave labor or whatever you want to call it. Because the argument against sweatshops simply leads to companies not investing in those countries, which is why we don't have that many sweatshops in Africa, and we should. But there's a lot of red tape over there, so nobody wants to build over there. Instead, they'll go to Indonesia or Malaysia. Consequently, people in Indonesia and Malaysia are much richer now than they otherwise would be, and it's for precisely that reason. To give you a good example, are the busybodies in Washington, D.C., not that long ago, in 2005, 2007, decided, you know what, those people in American Samoa, they deserve a living wage, and we're going to impose the minimum wage on people living in Samoa. So what happened is there was a tuna canning factory over there. Everyone depended on, I think they employed like 1/3 of the island. And what ends up happening is that the representative from Samoa was trying to lobby Congress and say, hey, you cannot impose the federal minimum wage on Samoa. That's going to kill us. It's going to kill the tuna factory is going to pack up and leave. And, the busybodies in Congress and, the good people who want to protect American jobs and wages, they said, no, we need to impose a living wage or the minimum wage onto Samoa. So they did that. And as predicted, as any economist could have told you would have happened, the tuna factory simply packed up shop and left Samoa. Consequently, 1/3 of the island is now unemployed there, and they're receiving federal assistance. And somehow, according to your argument, they're better off now because I guess now we're gonna have some Samoan entrepreneurs gonna open up and that their economy there in Samoa is going to naturally improve all by itself. But there's a reason why there's a super majority consensus on the issue of free trade. What you're describing is a largely a heterodox economic theory that is not really taught in universities anymore because it's kind of like communism at this point. Arguments against free trade simply don't work. If free trade was a good idea, we'd have barriers to trade between the states. The European Union wouldn't exist, for example. A lot of the TPP and China's free trade agreements over there wouldn't exist. The reason those things exist is because they work and they benefit all the countries involved.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. No. Okay, yeah, well, okay, I just missed out on a minute here, but here I'm going to try to say this again. I'm not arguing against free trade. I'm not arguing against the individual being able to operate in a free market. I'm against special corporations being able to undermine existing free markets by dumping cheap products into existing markets domestically through economies of scope that undermine the existing workforce that's already there. The best analogy I can give you is the TPP, the CAFTA and NAFTA. Why were they 150 pages long? If it was a free trade agreement, it would be pretty simple. We agree not to put, not to put quotas, tariffs, or any type of barriers to your products entering our country if you do the same. But that wasn't the agreement. The agreement gives special stipulations to existing corporations in places like China, places like Indonesia, and places like in the Middle East that are unable to have special privileges. This is what globalism is today. Globalization undermines the ability of a free market to operate. Small businesses, if you haven't noticed, have been collapsing all over the place throughout the United States. The reason they are collapsing is because globalist international corporations are able to take over and use through economies of scale and economies of scope are able to undermine a market and basically take over. The result of that has been the average worker has not been able to see a wage increase. And let me go through this. Your example with Malaysia. I'm not arguing that they would be better off. I'm arguing that an economy that is already operating with rule of law, economy that has rule of law that opens their borders to competition from international corporations that don't have to follow rule of law and are able to treat their workers like slaves, are not operating on a playing field that would be permissible within these boundaries, yet they're able to actually sell their products.
Oh shit. Okay, you pass it. I just want to point out you keep bringing up the slave labor thing, but the data on this is very transparent and obvious and can't really be disputed. There's one line that activists and political activists they always talk about sweatshops from one angle, but economists talk about it from a completely different angle, and that's based on evidence and facts. To give you a quick quote, controlling for all other plant level characteristics, foreign-owned plants pay higher, often substantially higher wages than locally owned firms. And we know that to be the case. We know that people would rather work in a Nike sweatshop or whatever than they would some local Chinese, employment or whatever. Even a small business in China is going to pay a lot cheaper and shittier wages, and they're going to be treated worse on average than, the Nike corporation will treat them. So people who criticize the slave labor and sweatshop, they're never comparing apples to apples. They're comparing jobs in China to jobs in America. Well, that's not really a valid comparison. The economic conditions are not even remotely similar. And just to refute the wage argument, I thought I've already done that, but Samoa was the best example I could possibly give you of what you're saying not actually being the case. The government tried to increase wages there in Samoa, and it led to mass unemployment. And you know what? Somebody in Samoa didn't pick up the mantle and start producing more factories in Samoa. That's absolutely not what happened. What happened is everyone's simply unemployed now, and they had to, join the military or move to America or do something like that. So the arguments against free trade don't really work, even if you want to increase wages. I've already demonstrated we've lifted 1 billion people out of abject poverty. So even the math and the numbers are wrong in your case. The only argument that you could make was, as you said, ethno-nationalism. And I want to add one last thing. Your arguments against the TPP are all arguments against economic nationalism and writing in special clauses for your special corporations.
Globalism, by definition, is modern manifestation. Is the TPP, is CAFTA, is NAFTA. I'm saying that's what globalism is. What free trade is what I described. I don't oppose free trade, which is why you keep creating this straw man. You keep creating a straw man that all the arguments against free trade don't work. You gave an example of where a government tried to impose a minimum wage and saw massive unemployment. That's a government imposition of a price floor on a free market. I want to say one thing. I do have it, which is irrelevant to this conversation, but I do want to say that the The point that I'm saying is a nuanced point, and it's that what we understand as free trade is not the same thing as globalism. When I say nationalism is superior, I'm just saying nationalism as we know it, it would be the United States. The United States itself has seen its wages been stagnant. Now, what am I saying for that? I'm not saying that the government can impose a price floor to be able to solve that problem. I'm not saying that the government should be able to have quotas on their borders. I'm saying that the only people that should be able to operate on our market are the people that have the same rule of law and would be able to practice their labor practices without having fear of going to jail for treating their wages for treating theirs